trouble is,
if the answer was no, they would answer it.
Exactly. But then the problem is, it's not an easy question to answer yes or no, because if they say yes, well, if you're heavily dependent on Russia for software coding and your whole business is about software coding, then all of a sudden
just suddenly pulling the plug.
You're pulling the plug on a huge amount of your workforce.
And we spoke. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. Weather's still nice, isn't it? If anything, even nicer than it was a week ago.
This week
it's been nice all week.
For ages.
I know. I've been
starting from last weekend.
Been risking getting a tan when I take the dog for a walk.
Yeah.
And it's got to a stage where I feel guilty if I don't take a little. We have this little flask of doggy water you can take out, and it's a clever thing. It's basically a flask with a little mini bowl attached to it, and you just press a button, it fills up, and the dog.
Oh, nice.
Sort of, and then I keep forgetting, and I come home and the dog's just half an hour in his dog bowl.
I've only been out all week though, actually, to be honest.
You've hardly been out?
Yeah.
How come?
Until yesterday. I didn't leave the house for 3 days.
Just being busy?
Well, I did a half marathon on Sunday.
Oh, so you did? Congratulations.
And I felt really shit
What was your time?
I bet you fucking did.
Oh, it was really bad. I'm not even going to say it. It's half an hour slower than the last time I did it in.
But when was the last time you did it?
The last time I did one was 3 years ago.
Oh, okay. So you've lost half an hour in 3 years?
Yeah, well,
that's shameful.
Things have happened.
You disgust
since then,
me.
So
it's probably a bad day.
I mean, I didn't feel like I was going that much slower, but it was a slow. I mean, and it was just.
But were you trying to push yourself?
I mean, I find it hard these days anyway, doing long runs, but there was just like waves of people. You sort of set off in a certain wave depending on how you think you're going to get on. And I just remember the first 8 miles, it just seemed like the whole of London was going past me.
Overtaking you.
And it's around Hampton Court, so it's on these like narrow lanes by the side of the river. There's not a lot of people to get around, and I just halfway through I was just thinking, I've had enough of this. I just don't want to.
But you'd obviously
I did do it.
You'd run the distance in training prior to that.
No, I'd done sort of 10 or 11 at weekends for a long time. So and you sort of think the last
10 or 11,
two
it's 13.
Yeah. So you
was this the
last 2 or 3?
Landmark marathon.
Hampton Court half marathon.
Half marathon. Have you ever run a full marathon?
No, I don't think I could do that.
Even in your pomp?
Well, when I was 30, 31, and I was quite quick, I could have done one, but I didn't do one then.
Okay.
But I probably could have done one. But I did it with 3 mates, and they were all. I mean, by the time I finished,
they were already on their
beer.
second pint. Yeah. No, I saw your Facebook post on the matter.
And then I felt really shit for like 3 days. So
just phically.
Yeah, just really tired and so I just
I'm not surprised.
All week.
I don't think I'm trying to. The most I could run without stopping would probably be about a mile. So you're 13 times better than I am.
Yeah.
Not that I'm your marker for physical fitness.
You can build up to it.
Yeah. No, well, we've got a cross trainer at home now, doing all the.
I was well over 2 hours, I think, timing wise.
Right.
The quickest I've ever done one's about 1:40.
And sort of
31.
Kenyans and Ethiopians run the full marathon in about 2 hours, don't they?
When I did a half marathon, I did 2:03.
I was much over that.
Done.
It was somewhere around the 2:15 mark, I think.
That's good. I did that like 5 years ago. 2 hours, and I thought that was like the best I could do. So if you did 2:15,
I'm obviously in awe of both of you.
Honestly, when I finished, I was like, so wait, people do this like twice in a row?
Yeah, no,
that's
this is the thing. It's like if you were like a sort of fast marathon runner, I could have been lapped if they were doing the same course again.
I mean,
yeah, totally.
It's like, what the hell? They're going twice as fast.
Yeah,
how do you do that for
just
26
sprinting
miles?
For 2 hours.
Yeah.
Well, you're not getting any younger, Ian.
I know. Yeah.
Well, I still think it's an awesome achievement, but this is only my shitty basis for comparison, where I give myself a pat on the back for getting to the top of the stairs. So there we go.
The best thing about it was afterwards going out to the pub and eating like this huge roast and
having earned the fuck out of it.
So it's probably another reason I felt bad the next day.
Right, because you'd had half a cow. Yeah, so but it's good to see you feeling all right now, mate.
Yeah.
We'll go for a run after, eh?
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Okay, I haven't done that. I have gone on the cross trainer a couple of times. Actually, it was a funny thing. We bought this cross trainer, and I bought a weight bench and some dumbbells, and they're quite cool dumbbells because I didn't want to have loads of dumbbells. We haven't got that much space in the house.
Oh yeah,
didn't want to have loads of them. These are like modular. You can twist on extra weights, so these can range from 7 kilos to 15 kilos, and like 15 kilos is about the maximum I can sort of bicep curl.
Yeah.
And then there's other things that, not so good, like it's a bit harder to do those sorts of things. Anyway, and but I got them a month or two ago, and so I'd stopped going to the gym because I was like, but there was this gap in between stopping going to the gym and starting to use the stuff at home. And so this week, maybe inspired by you, I started doing that at home. So that's why I look so ripped now.
Shows.
We'll have people tuning in and watching this episode more than listening to it now.
Oh my God, put your shirt back on.
Yeah. Steady on, Scott. You've had a couple of days on the cross trainer. That's not top off territory. So there we go. Okay, that's enough wittering, isn't it?
Yeah.
What are we going to chat about this week? We have to have sort of longer than usual preamble because we've not been overwhelmed with massive news stories this week, but we've decided that both of us have written a little bit about Russia, obviously in the context of all the aggro, and there's a telecoms/tech angle from both of us on that. So we're going to lead on Russia, and this is like Russia as opposed to Ukraine, but it's all part of the same mess. And then we're going to talk about T-Mobile US. They had one of those, this is what we're thinking type of things. Neville Ray, who's like their chief technologist and is part of that whole slightly overstated, unsubtle, in-your-face sort of way of delivery they have that was sort of pioneered under
It's
Ledger.
quite slick.
Right.
I mean, he's obviously a Brit originally, isn't he?
But
you can tell from his accent.
He's
But his whole
mid-Atlantic.
delivery is very sort of all American now.
Yeah,
and it's very
no.
sort of glitzy, that whole presentation. I thought.
Well, I didn't. Mary covered it for us.
Yeah.
So I didn't watch this. I'm gonna be relying on you largely, but I'll obviously chip in. But fair play. I think Neville. God, I think I saw him live at Mobile Congress a few years ago. He obviously gets the presentation shtick.
Oh yeah, he's really good at it.
Yeah. But sometimes you're like, all right, Neville, calm down, mate. Anyway, I am. And then we're going to finish off. I wrote a thing. It's not necessarily a huge story, but I think it makes for an interesting conversation. There's a new smartphone brand called Nothing, which is a weird name
It's almost as bad as everything
for a
everywhere.
thing. Yeah, it's the opposite of EE. Nothing, nowhere. They're called NN.
Why is Nothing a good brand? I mean, it's just...
Well, quite. Well, that's part of what we're going to talk
I
about.
was going to say, they have the Twitter @nothing. I don't know
Yeah.
how they got that.
Yeah, maybe that's why. They said, what's a memorable word that we can get a Twitter of? And then we'll base
For
our
free.
whole brand identity around that. So we're going to talk about them and more broadly the scope or lack of for innovation in smartphones.
Yeah.
So that's what we'll do. And just to remind you that if you're watching this on the site or on YouTube or on Facebook, you can also listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and loads of other podcasting platforms.
Oh, wait, sorry. I need to do the shout of the
All
month.
right, yeah, go for it, mate.
I just realized.
I
Let's
haven't
see
had a
who
drink
it
for
is.
2 minutes.
Ooh, interesting. I'll do the podium. First city is Oslo.
Right.
And then followed by Columbus. And then Columbia City. Where is that?
Columbus and Columbia City.
Yes, separate cities apparently.
You'd think Columbia City would be in DC.
Columbus is in Ohio, is it?
No. Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know where Columbia
That's
City
where
is.
Steven
Well,
Spielberg.
so DC is District of Columbia. So you'd imagine.
Columbia City is Washington State.
There we go. Oh, Washington State.
Yeah.
Oh,
so
so
you were
okay.
somewhat right.
Well, I was right in the Washington bit, but the wrong side of America.
Wow.
Fair
wait, there's
enough.
another Columbia.
I think
No, wait. There's another Columbia City
I bet there's dozens of them.
in Illinois.
America's a bit too
Or
obsessed
Indiana.
with Christopher Columbus. I think they need to calm it down a little bit. Look, he just got in a boat and landed somewhere. Let's not blow this out of proportion.
Wasn't even there.
There's two. There's one in
Yeah.
Indiana, one in Washington. I don't know which one it is, but
Wasn't it Haiti where he landed?
Right. Yeah, well, probably initially in the Caribbean somewhere, yeah.
Dominican Republic, I think.
Dominican
Yeah.
Republic.
Dominican
It wasn't-
Republic
it
is
wasn't-
the,
he never
is
got
the
to the
eastern side
mainland.
of Hispaniola, so that makes
I don't
more
think he ever
sense.
got to the mainland. That was people after him who got there.
Columbus never landed on mainland USA.
I don't think so. He discovered the Americas, but he basically spent all
No,
his time
Amerigo
faffing around.
Vespucci discovered
There
the
you are.
Americas.
Columbus.
He-
Is that where the name comes from?
He's-
Yeah. Amerigo Vespucci
Yeah,
was
that- I-
before Columbus.
Imagine, it could be called Dave.
He just
if a
messed around in the
different bloke
Caribbean, I
discovered it.
think, old Columbus.
He got distracted doing salsaing and drinking rum.
Yeah, spreading disease around and
Generally arsing
generally
things
wiping
up for the
out
locals.
the natives.
And he went, you ain't seen nothing yet.
Well, he's
Okay.
seen his coronavirus, he said.
Yes.
Well, he did kill a lot of natives with the diseases.
Well, quite. Okay. God, I didn't know
On that
Columbus
shipwreck
never
note-
got on mainland USA. I feel so ignorant.
Well, and they say really the Vikings probably got there in
That's
like
true.
1100 or something.
Eric the
yeah.
Viking.
Yeah. When it was icy and they
Oh,
could just walk
Leif
over.
Erikson, wasn't it?
Something like that.
Leif
yeah.
You
Erikson.
can just walk
yeah.
over.
Yeah, when it was all icy.
From where?
From across
From
the top.
Norway?
No, going through Greenland. And
Tell
all
you what,
that.
you want to take a packed lunch
you go
for
through
that.
Greenland, like
Right.
the planes fly when they're...
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they were hanging out in Greenland anyway, thinking this is a bit shit.
They were like, wait, how
Why
thick
did
is
someone
the
call
ice?
it Greenland when it's just covered in ice?
That's the trick, yeah.
Yeah.
I bet there
tell
was
you
some
what,
people
what's
coming
over there?
from Siberia the other way. No,
Maybe, yeah.
probably into North
Right.
America.
Vikings, man, they were hardcore. They didn't fuck around.
No.
I think I'm part of Viking because both sides of my family are from East
Okay.
Anglia. Yeah, no, I'm not trying to say I'm hard or anything, but both
You've
sides
already
of my
taken your shirt off.
So Scott's really taking this cross trainer seriously. They're both parts of my family from East Anglia, and that's where the Vikings used to turn up and get up to their crazy business. So I'm probably the product of a Viking pillage at some stage in the past.
It's like they say a certain percent of Chinese people are from Genghis Khan.
Yeah. Well, actually, a lot
Like
of
5% or something.
yeah,
Crazy.
a lot of the world. He
Yeah.
was a busy boy. All right. Anyway, that's quite enough tangential bullshit. And on to the sober topic of Russia. We're not gonna dwell on the actual war and all that stuff. But as we covered, it's either last week or the week before. The sort of geopolitical consensus on Russia that everything Russian is now bad. I mean, obviously it was there a little bit ever since the end of the Second World War, Cold War and all that sort of thing, but it's definitely come back with renewed vigour since they invaded Ukraine. Has had knock-on effects for business because we've got all these sanctions and now suddenly you can't even stock Smirnoff in the off licence because that's Russian. So it's just got hysterical, it's just got weird.
For real? There's no vodka here.
No, I think that's a slight exaggeration, but I've heard some reports on people. What it really is, a lot of time now when it comes to corporate reputation is no one really understands how social media works and they're shit scared of it. So when something happens that could have viral reputational implications, companies tend to just shoot first and ask questions later.
Yeah.
Like, let's just sever all ties
Scattered gun.
and then work out what a sensible, proportional, nuanced reaction would have been later. And that's what's happening with Russian stuff. And that obviously has a few effects. But, a big one, and we spoke about this when we discussed it before, and I think we spoke about Huawei and we spoke about Amdocs, is what does a given company do if they do have interests there? So I will start by handing it over to you, Ian, having framed it that way. You wrote a story along those lines. Why don't you give us it from the top?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's key for tech because a lot of the sanctions are specifically aimed at technology. I think a lot of the US sanctions about sort of shipping, semiconductors, pretty much like what they did against Huawei. And I guess you can kind of see why, because some of this stuff's dual purpose stuff, so it has military uses.
Yeah.
And also there's the fear that, it's not like McDonald's closing burger, shops because it's
and they're
worried
just
about
doing that.
reputation.
They're just doing that.
Well,
for
they're
the
doing that because they know they're going to lose all their business in Europe if they don't. Because people go, we're going to boycott McDonald's.
And also,
they're not doing anything.
there's even more basic pragmatic reasons, which is the supply chains are all fucked up, and they're probably not even going to be able to.
There might be that, but I think a lot of it's reputational for a lot of companies.
I agree.
And whereas I think with the tech thing, it's a bit more. The governments are sort of watching and looking at them, and it's a bit more kind of important. But it's interesting that. I've been looking at the social media pages of a guy called Mykola Fedorov, who's actually the Ukrainian deputy prime minister.
Okay.
And he's also minister for digital transformation, actually a digital transformation minister.
Who knew?
And for him, digital transformation at the moment is basically
keeping things going,
purging Russia of tech companies.
Right.
So his whole Twitter feed is basically just so-and-so's done this and so-and-so's done that. And it's like you get a round of applause or... How dare you?
So what's he doing? He's grassing up companies that are still doing stuff in Russia.
This is one he put, which I put at the top of my story. So SAP, really interestingly, in the early days of all this, it's only been going on a month, but pretty much 2 or 3 weeks ago, SAP's CEO, Christian Klein, came out with this statement that SAP will no longer serve Russian customers and we're stopping all work there. And then about a day later, he had to put an amendment in his statement to say we'll carry on supporting customers that we already do work for, but we're not going to sell any new stuff. And we've talked about this before, the contractual obligations that you have. And I'm pretty sure that probably what happened is he put this statement up and then some angry Russians with their lawyers got on the phone and went, hang on a minute, we can't possibly run our business anymore without SAP's system.
You can't just fucking pull out. Do you know, actually, it's a quick, sorry to interrupt, where when we spoke about it on that pod, our former colleague Wei, who's now at Nokia, commented on Twitter, and he pointed out a legal thing called force majeure.
Yeah.
Don't know why we got to bring French into it.
I like the effort.
Isn't that like an unforeseeable act of God or
force
something?
majeure.
Major force.
Which is, it's acts of God and war.
Yeah.
War comes into
Right,
that.
okay.
And it was a point well made by him, but I thought, what are the nuances of that? If there's a war, does that mean that all your legal obligations are suddenly out the door?
Totally. I mean, I think this is a question actually for some of these companies like Ericsson and Nokia that were very quick to sort of say we're pausing shipments and we won't do that. And they're more sort of perceived as being hardware companies, yeah? And therefore, when Biden came out with his statement about not using US origin technology, is pretty much similar thing to what they'd done against Huawei. I suspect some of that would have affected Ericsson and Nokia anyway. They probably did it because they were worried about the legal implications of not. But they're the same. They have contracts with big Russian operators. And if something goes wrong with your base station, and maybe it's something to do with the software problem, what are they doing at the moment? And presumably they have staff as well in Russia. They're more increasing their software companies themselves. I mean, it's an interesting question for them that I've not dug into. But the SAP one's really interesting because this happened. And anyway, Fedorov put that tweet. I mean, people won't be able to see this obviously unless they're actually watching, but he posted a tweet saying, I mean, this is verbatim, how much longer will you continue help Russia to kill children in Ukraine, Christian Klein? SAP continues supporting bloody Russian companies to make money to destroy Ukraine. And then there's SAP's logo.
Oh, yeah, that's it. I saw that.
Which sort of looks a bit like a Stanley
with
knife
blood
anyway,
dripping off the bottom of it.
with blood.
And the red bit makes it look a bit like a Russian flag as well, because they're red, white and blues bands, aren't they?
And
clever design there.
And he's
they're not being subtle about it.
They're not being subtle, but he's also, as well as sort of calling out companies. I mean, you can see why the Ukrainians are doing what they're doing. They're obviously trying to sort of they're trying to hurt Russia as much as possible. They know there's not going to be a no-fly zone imposed over Ukraine probably because that would sort of draw NATO into a war. And they're desperate.
I mean, I've seen it with Zelensky. When he was talking to England, he invoked Churchill and started fighting on the beaches. When he spoke to Americans, he started talking about Pearl Harbor and shit like that. When he spoke to Israel, he started invoking the Holocaust. And he's just pulling out all the stops to tug the heartstrings.
He's pretty good at doing it, And anyway, because I've been sort of tracking companies in the telecom, I mean, we've written about Huawei and Ericsson and Nokia with all this because they're the big ones. And then, I think we brought up Amdocs a couple of weeks ago. And one really interesting company that Fedorov actually mentioned in his sort of social media output this week, and it wasn't on Twitter, it was on Instagram, and it was in Ukrainian. So I had to go and get it sort of translated.
You got a person? You got a Ukrainian person?
No, because it's in Cyrillic. I mean, I got my wife to do it actually. I don't know what she did with it, but she came back with what seemed like a fairly accurate translation.
Right.
And then I compared it with other reports of what he'd said as well.
Is there much overlap between Ukrainian and Slovakian?
Well, there might be in spoken, but it's Cyrillic in Ukrainian, so it might sound the same, but you're looking at a different alphabet.
Right.
So,
well, that's a challenge.
I mean, if you the thing about like Slovakia is that you did learn Russian growing up when you're of that generation.
Right. Okay.
If you're over middle age and you sort of grew up in the 80s,
of course, because it was Eastern Bloc. Yeah.
So, but his tweet so the company I was sort of following is Netcracker, which is a competitor to Amdocs
in the sort of BSS
in the BSS
space.
OSS telecom space. So very much a software company doing back office systems, and they're actually owned by NEC, which is a Japanese company, but they're headquartered in America. Interestingly, they're headquarters in Massachusetts.
Was it an acquisition?
I don't know the history of it.
Because they've been part of NEC for as long as I can remember.
They have, and it's a little bit like, it's almost like Rakuten and Altiostar, yeah? Altiostar's based in the US, but it's now wholly owned by a Japanese player.
Fair enough.
And what Fedorov had to say about, they came out with a big statement on LinkedIn, Netcracker, describing the war as unlawful and saying, this is it. Yeah, there's a moral obligation to avoid operating in countries that have forsaken peace. We're directing operations away from Russia and have suspended sales and investments in the country. And then Fedorov came out after they'd done that and said the company halts sales and investments in the aggressor country, closes training centres and halts hiring. Clients of Netcracker were dozens of large companies in Russia. And then he sort of thanks them for their help.
Okay, so they got a pat on the head from...
They got a pat on the head. But if you look into it, it's a bit more complicated than that because they're really exposed to Russia in terms of their workforce.
Okay.
That's not a recent thing. They've relied on Russian coders, software coders, for a long time.
Is this so that's an interesting thing, because like there's certain countries we associate with outsourcing. For example, India gets a lot of outsourcing for like service industries, like call centers.
They have a lot of staff in India as well.
China is obviously the world's manufacturer a lot of time. Is Russia one of those places where there's a lot of
software
like IT,
talent.
like software?
It is.
Right.
Yeah, and I suspect it's quite low cost as well. So
Yes. Well, that'll be why you do it, isn't it?
So I looked at. It's not a new thing. In fact, I think a few years ago there's reporting about Netcracker having to reassure US government customers that the Russians weren't able to kind of slip backdoors into Netcracker products.
Naughty code.
Because they serve some government organisations, and it's pretty much the same worry that you get with Huawei. The US has been going on about, if you buy Chinese equipment from Huawei, it's very closely linked to the state because it's a totalitarian state. Therefore, the Chinese can go and do what they want with Huawei's products.
Because of course in the West the state has no influence over private enterprise at all.
Yeah. So there were already concerns. You can imagine those concerns now. But they have. So I looked at LinkedIn data, which I know isn't exactly. Certain people have LinkedIn accounts, certain people don't. I think in the past when I've looked at LinkedIn data, you can get a fairly accurate idea. It's an
anecdotal straw poll.
You can get a fairly accurate idea of what headcount's like, or certainly to do with the proportions of people anyway. So there's 7,500 Netcracker staff with LinkedIn profiles across the whole company. And about 2,000 of those are based in Russia, rather.
Out of what was the figure?
Out of 7,500.
That's a good old chunk, isn't it?
That's the overall organisation. That's not just software people, obviously. That's the whole company. So we're saying anecdotally a quarter or so. Yeah. So, Netcracker themselves sort of dispute that. They're kind of, those headcount figures aren't quite accurate. But then you say to them, well, what are the headcount figures? And they won't give you a number.
I can imagine Netcracker were a big fan of your story.
Well, yeah. There were things in it that they probably didn't like. But the interesting thing to me is that when they've come out with this statement which suggests that they've completely severed all ties, and it almost implies that they're not using
what
any
about
Russian
those 2,000 coders? Yeah,
and that's almost the implication. But if you ask them the question, do you still have people in Russia writing code that's being used in products? They won't answer it. And the trouble is, if
the answer was no, they would answer it.
Exactly. But the problem is, it's not an easy question to answer yes or no, because if they say yes, well, if you're heavily dependent on Russia for software coding and your whole business is about software coding, then all of a sudden
just
you're
suddenly pulling the plug.
You're pulling the plug on a huge amount of your workforce.
And we spoke, I think it was last week, about how difficult Vodafone's hiring software talent. You can't just go, it's all right, there's 2,000 of them sitting around in London.
And the other complicating factor is that another 900 of their staff are in Ukraine. So that's almost that's almost an eighth. It's more than an eighth if that's an accurate. It's 7,500 people and 900 in Ukraine.
So now we're getting to almost a third exposed to that region.
Where they've said that their statement on this whole matter is a lot more sort of forthcoming about what they're doing to support Ukrainian staff. It's like, we're continuing to pay them and we're being very supportive.
Nice,
but nothing, but very little at all about any people involved in in Russia.
Yeah.
But even so, you imagine that a lot of those Ukrainian workers, given what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, possibly aren't in a position to work. Some of them might have left the country. They might just not have access to facilities. I was reading, I think Kyivstar, which is one of the... No, not Kyivstar. Turkcell has an operation, I think, in Ukraine. It's one of the operators that works there. And they were saying this week that 10% of their base stations are now down. I'm surprised it's only 10%, actually. I thought it might be more than that. But obviously some of the infrastructure is not.
I think nearly all the aggro militarily has been focused on a few cities, hasn't it?
It has.
The Russians use cell phones to call each other.
If that's where you're based, and if you're working in a city as a Ukrainian programmer, and connectivity's down and presumably fixed line infrastructure has been affected as well, especially if it's sort of poles and whatever, then it's going to be hard to get anything done, isn't it? It's not as though you're in a position where you can kind of go to work and carry on coding, and that's probably your last priority.
I don't know how people are just sort of existing and coping and getting on with things at all.
So it's a big issue for Netcracker. I mean, it's sales wise. I mean, just to put it into sort of perspective, they don't publish details of their revenues. NEC doesn't break it out in its reports.
I see.
But if you talk to analyst sources,
not at all.
No.
Interesting.
But they do talk
NEC's
about
public.
NEC's public, and they do talk about what they make from telecom and from software and this sort of thing. But there's more to it than just Netcracker on that side of things. So you have to talk to analysts who've done the numbers and try to sort of calculate a figure for what they think it is. And I can't say who the figures come from because I don't think it'd be fair. But they were saying it's probably somewhere between $750 million and sort of 900 million, something like that. But more on the lower side of it.
This is a number for what?
For Netcracker's annual revenues.
Okay, right.
And again, Netcracker, if you ask them, or if you stick that number in a story, which I did, they come back and say, "Oh no, it's nothing like that. It's not even in the right ballpark." But they don't. They won't give you the figure. So
what is this? 20 questions.
But it's a really
write a next story and write it just like 10% more, and then when they stop giving you a hard time, you got it right.
I mean, it's just a really awkward. I mean, it's not just Netcracker, obviously. It's anybody who's sort of involved in that region and has a technology business, and it's going to have an impact on the whole supply chain, obviously, just because of what it's doing in terms of energy prices and raw materials and all this sort of stuff. But Netcracker to me is an example of a company where the exposure they have to that region, just from a staffing perspective, makes what's going on really worrying for them, I would think.
Yes. I think your headline was it's a nightmare for them.
Well, that was because it is. I don't see how you could put it any other way. When you've got a third of your staff or whatever it is, between a quarter and a third based in that area doing, and a lot of them involved in. A lot of them are involved in the brainy bit of the business. Yeah, they're the guys where you get your value. Then how do you cope with that? I mean, as I say, you carry on using them. You're going to have people presumably in the US going, hang on a minute. This is if there's ever going to be a time when Russia's trying to get malicious code into what that company might do, then it's now. And if there's ever a time where anyone who's basic, I mean, another thing that's just been so stark to me, as a real civil libertarian and a fan of George Orwell and all that sort of thing. Have you seen any of this footage of Russians who just even try and say anything, and then suddenly 4 goons stick them in the back of a van? I mean, it's just totally oppressive. Yeah. Obviously it's not as tragic as cities getting destroyed and civilians and theatres getting bombed and shit like that. But what's happening to the Russian people feels like a step back to full Stalinism, totally. 50s. Well, and that was Russia. The Economist's headline, wasn't it? One week, the Stalinisation of Russia was last week's. And and people just getting sent off to the modern equivalent of gulags, and all that sort of thing. So the reason it's relevant to what you're talking about is, if you're a coder who lives in Russia and someone goes, Vlad wants you to fuck with this, what are you going to do? Go tell Vlad to shove it. So Netcracker apparently, from someone I spoke to, has had in the past to provide sort of reassurance that can't happen. They've had to show that they have security tools that stop that from happening. But you sort of think, well, how do they do that? It's, governments always seem to be one step ahead on this kind of thing anyway, the sort of cyber experts within governments, don't they? And, Russia's regarded as one of the countries that goes in for this big time, supposedly messing around. Yeah, well, actually, that's my active contribution to this chat. We'll get onto that in a sec. Yeah, but I just think it puts them in a difficult position because they either carry on using those people and have a way to code and a way to sort of support business operations, or they don't, and maybe that's reassuring to some of their customers in the West, but at the same time, it's. It's just a really thorny. And the other thing that's interesting is, I mean, I won't say who it is, but there's obviously some jitters amongst operators that aren't based in the US about Netcracker at the moment, where you mention them, and one operator in particular got very nervous at the mere mention of the name,
What, because of the stuff that you've just been talking about?
Because of association with Netcracker and
the Russian coders.
Well, I think possibly it hadn't got to that stage by then anyway, but it's possibly more of a reputational thing. I mean, I think this is one that is an interesting one for operators generally still using Huawei equipment. The fact that Huawei's continuing to maintain a relationship with Russian operators and hasn't joined the sort of Western embargo. I wrote a piece where I just went around basically asking European operators, are you going to carry on using this company? Because this is where it's getting to now. It's getting to the point where we were talking about embargoes on McDonald's.
Yeah.
People sort of boycotting McDonald's perhaps if they didn't close their stores.
If you carry on guilt by association,
you carry on buying your stuff from Huawei, and all of a sudden you're accused of
indirectly supporting
Russia's regime. So
and I'm actually not a fan of that. I don't like this domino effect of complicity, and then this sort of broader thing, and it's sort of stuff that the Yanks have been into for ages, all the way back to your sort of post 9/11, and this is what allowing for the fact that they were entitled to have some fairly strong opinions after 9/11.
Yeah.
But this, you're either with us or against us, sort of binary black and whiteness. I'm not a fan of it, and and we're continuing to get this over Russia, and some of it I get. I mean, we know, that there's all been people like Zelensky and probably your mate Fedorov, they're all into this no-fly zone. But we know that a no-fly zone basically means NATO goes to war with Russia.
Yeah.
So it's World War III.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's unreasonable to go, do you know what? I don't fancy World War III.
No.
First two didn't go so well.
Yeah.
So were you going to say something?
I was like, imagine that.
Yeah.
So the other one that's I don't think we've mentioned it on the pod before, but the other one that's interesting from this whole tech tie-up with Russia, what's happening is ARM.
Right. That's it. We were thinking about talking about it last week and we didn't, but by all means bring it up now.
I mean, it's more, and my angle is not the smartphone side of things at all. It's to do with data center infrastructure.
Right.
And actually to do with Huawei, largely. Huawei has a big cloud business, or not a particularly big cloud business, but they're certainly trying to position that as a growth opportunity for them. It's something they've been trying to get into.
Yep, one of their pivots.
But it's actually very hardware dependent. If you're going to run data centers and try and do what the public clouds do, you need servers, you need equipment.
We tend to talk of increments of football fields, don't we?
Totally.
There'll come a stage where we talk about increments of Wales, which is the next one up.
And so if you look at the hardware that you need for that, I mean, the chips have tended to come from Intel, x86 chips, basically. In fact, if you look at that whole market, and I got the figures from Omdia, data center processors, I think Intel's got a 70% market share. AMD's got about 18%.
Which is x86 as well.
Which is x86 as well, leaving 5% left. Who does that 5%? People basically using ARM's architecture.
Because it's the only other microarchitecture.
There's RISC-V, I think, but it's got which is an open source alternative, but it doesn't have any market share at the moment. So now what Huawei's done is, because it can't buy x86 chips anymore because they're US origin technologies, it's sort of pivoted to ARM. It's
which
churning
is rational
out these
from its point of view.
Kunpeng processors, which its own high silicon unit designs based on ARM architecture. And if you remember back a couple of years ago, there was a big sort of a lot of reporting by the BBC about whether ARM was going to sever ties with Huawei.
Yeah,
there was a memo that went round, in fact, saying we're stopping operations because
I remember writing that up a few years ago.
All of our stuff is a lot of our stuff's US origin, so we can't risk selling to Huawei anymore. And then a few months later, they sort of changed their minds. They got some lawyers involved to have a look at it, and it's not US origin. We can carry on. But the problem now is, Huawei's one of its sort of cloud markets is Russia. It opened this big ARM-based data center in Moscow about a year ago. And a lot of the Russian cloud companies, people like Yandex and Mail.ru, they're in a lot of trouble because of sanctions.
Along with every other Russian company, I would imagine.
So you got this awkward situation for ARM, where again, guilt by association, they could be accused of. I mean, ARM itself, I asked them for a position on Russia, and they've said we've stopped. Again, it's quite wishy-washy. We've stopped dealing with Russian companies, and we don't supply Russia anymore. And then you say, well, what about Huawei? And they were not prepared to comment on specific customers, I'm afraid. But you could sell to Huawei, couldn't you? And then they can deploy the equipment in Russia. Is that something that could happen? They won't tell you that.
And from Arm's point of view, given that what they sell is intellectual property, they don't sell anything physical at all.
Yeah.
How culpable can they be?
Well, exactly. They're not going to Huawei, well, we'll sell it to you, but you can't deploy it in Russia, are they, presumably?
Or Huawei's not going when they buy it off them that, we're going to be lobbing this over to Russia, because that's not how it works. They use it to make chips.
Yeah.
And then what they do with those chips, I mean, they could burn them all in a big bonfire. That's not Arm's business. The only thing Arm cares about, because its revenue model is twofold. There's the license, there's the upfront license, but then there's also royalty.
Yeah.
So it's a bit like all the shit that Qualcomm, everyone used to try and get Qualcomm in its business model, but you get this hybrid thing where you pay them an upfront for, let's say, the Cortex A20 chip, but then you also pay for every phone it ends up in. It's a tiny bit of it.
Yeah.
But like when you buy a phone for 500 quid or £1,000, so many stakeholders have got a piece of that action.
Yeah.
And they're all tracking. This used to be something like in my old job when I was a smartphone analyst, a lot of our clients would be people who just needed to have a sense of how many smartphones are being sold everywhere, because they don't necessarily have a very clear, explicit line of feedback from their own customers. And obviously there's an incentive for their customers to downplay it, go, nah, we didn't sell any phones. For some reason, no one wants to fucking buy any at the moment, because then they don't have to pay the royalties. And so they'd get Strategy Analytics and presumably Omdia and other such analyst firms to give them estimates, and then they could go back and go, well, I'm sorry, but these people reckon that a bunch got sold, so I think you're talking shit, son.
Yep.
Hollywood accounting.
Anyway, but so that's their model, and I think the Arm example is a really good one you brought up, because it's a classic example of this guilt by association. Where does the line of direct culpability, the sort of, they can be held liable for it, where does it stop?
Yeah.
When Arm sells a bit of IP, which then another company puts into a chip, which then maybe a third party resells onto someone else.
I can imagine some of these sort of aggressive US senators and politicians who don't, who've gone hard in on Huawei and don't like anybody having anything to do with it. The kind of people who were leaning on the UK to ban it when we did. I can imagine them not being particularly happy a couple of years ago when Arm said it would carry on supplying, Huawei, because look, it wouldn't just be the cloud business. Actually, it would have a massive impact on Huawei's other units as well, wouldn't it? Especially its devices one, if it couldn't get access to Arm blueprints.
Yeah.
That really would be a crippling blow if they couldn't do that anymore. And they were probably thinking, well, that's maybe one way of finishing it off once and for all, is to have that company not supply it. Now, given what's going on in Russia now, probably even more so, some of them are thinking, hang on a minute, this is not right that Arm's continuing to serve Huawei. So I'm not saying I want to have an opinion on it one way or the other. I'm just saying it's the sort of thing
this is the environment.
That's the environment we live in, and it's just all this is just really weird what's going on at the moment, this kind of entanglement that you see.
Well, I don't like it. I don't like it. The Americans can't say, we hate Huawei because we think they do their government's bidding. And then the amount they're throwing their weight around right now, and they can, but let's just be honest. They're throwing their weight around because they can. I think we had this chat about when we're talking about Ericsson getting fined for being naughty only by the Americans, when their naughtiness hadn't actually taken place in America.
Yeah.
And it was like, well, how come they do it? And the answer was because they can. And that's what they do.
Apparently other regulators could do the same thing. It's just they generally don't.
Isn't it because
they don't have the heft? They don't have the raw power.
They can't hurt you in the same way.
It could have been a dollar thing, but the real reason is America can, because they are the most powerful, richest country in the world.
I mean, the EU tends to come along and levy quite heavy fines against companies.
Yeah,
if you think about another one that does
they think of themselves as an equivalent.
Yeah, but I mean, Ericsson got asked about that actually on the call that they did at Mobile World Congress, where Boya Ekholm had to sort of explain that they were, he had to act all contrite, and I'm sure he is actually. I'm sure he's very embarrassed about it.
Yeah, so.
And he had to sort of say what they were doing, and they got asked a question: are you, could regulators in other countries take action? And that guy, Xavier de Dullen, who's now he's been axed, hasn't he? He was the fall guy.
Great name though.
He was their chief legal officer.
Oh, and then
He's
we got a new
basically
bloke called Scott who's coming. That's
so
the only one I
they've-
remember because I'm a
So
narcissist.
Xavier de Dullen has basically been kicked out.
He's
I
like-
think is
yeah.
is the
Which seems
harsh
reasonable.
way
It's
to
like,
put
well,
it.
Xavier, we're in legal trouble. You're the main legal bloke.
Well, I think he was the obvious fool guy
Yes.
because they said that they were implementing. I mean, getting off into a bit of a tangent
Yeah,
now,
yeah.
but they said they were implementing all these sort of reforms and improving corporate governance the last time they got fined,
Yeah.
and then this happens.
Turns out they're hanging out with ISIS.
And the DOJ specifically said you haven't done things and you haven't coughed up enough information and you've been sloppy in this area. So it sort of reflects on him, I think, and basically he's been forced out.
Right.
He's a weird guy on calls because he's one of these people who a journalist or an analyst will ask him a question and it's like a machine answering. It's like a machine that speaks legalese coming back. All of his answers
Probably
are
not
like
that surprising for a chief legal officer.
I
though.
suppose you can see why he's doing it, but
Yeah, yeah.
it's just really. And then you're listening to what he said, and you're trying to figure out what it actually means
And
because it's like reading a
gibberish.
contract.
Yeah. Yeah, God. I mean, if you ever read like with M&A or with court judgments or whatever, fucking hell, who'd be a lawyer?
Yeah. So the guy they've got in Scott, I can't remember his surname, but he apparently was at Vion, which is interesting as
Yeah,
well
so
because they're mainly Russian.
He's had his hands full.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it was an
Yeah.
interesting move. In fact, when we read that up, that was one of the most read stories.
Yeah.
I'm gonna move on to something I
Yeah.
want to say because there's an obvious segue. We've been talking about America, and obviously we've got to move it on for time anyway. The most Russian-y thing I wrote this week was headline was US President warns of impending Russian cyber attacks. Now,
Through Netcracker. That was just a joke.
you're not getting yourself on Netcracker's Christmas card list here, mate. And it's an interesting thing because until recently, if I'd seen something like that, I would have assumed it was just propaganda. I would have assumed it was just the US state yanking everyone's chain for whatever strategic purpose it has. But I think everyone had a little wake-up call. Do you remember just before the invasion of Ukraine, we had all like Bojo and Macron and Biden all going public and going, look, they're about to fucking invade. And we were like, yeah. I just thought they were bigging it up because we've just learnt to not trust these people. Like all through the pandemic, the sort of exaggeration of various bits and bobs.
Yeah.
I think most people's instinct, or maybe it's just people like me, is just to take everything that a public figure, especially a politician, says with a massive pinch of salt. But then when they were going on about how Russia's about to invade Ukraine, we were just like, yeah, you're just trying to shit everyone up. You're probably just trying to get some more defence budget because, goddamn, Grumman or some defence contractors sort of slipped you a brown envelope under the table, and then lo and behold he goes and invades, and then everyone has to sort of go, oh right, okay, they weren't talking shit on that one. And so now when I see something like this, where previously I might have been more sceptical, now I'm like, okay, I think we might have gone beyond the just lying phase, and there's probably some truth in it. So he talks for Biden, and obviously Biden himself, when he talks that there's extra complications to do with the fact that he's not the most coherent at this stage in his life. But, he's just a spokesperson, really. It's not like he's been sitting there going, oh, hold on a sec, they're fucking up to something. And so he's passing on the message from his sort of security state. And, and basically that concern, and it hasn't come to light yet. When was this written? 3 days ago. Was that there was going to be a massive sort of Russian sort of cyber attack. And as you alluded to earlier, they've got a lot of capabilities in that area. And even if everything was cool, they'd be fucking around with that stuff. And they have these sort of dotted line ones, like they sort of encourage hacker groups without them being directly employed by the state. But they basically make it clear to them that you go ahead, you got no worries about us kicking your door down. And it's so there's just so much of it going on constantly. It's a bizarre little sort of arms race by itself, the hacker versus security side of things. And he was basically imploring private companies to just up their security spend, was the long and short of it. And again, you'd sort of think, well, what's going on there? Has he got a mate who's just started working at fucking Norton?
How reliable is all this stuff
Norton.
anyway?
McAfee.
Yeah, exactly. Or has he got?
Yeah, that'll work.
Or has he just bought shares in one of those VPNs that always advertise on podcasts?
NordVPN.
Yeah, NordVPN or whatever.
That's good.
But I was, I know Norton's like a brand from the past, isn't it? You used to buy a box of Norton with a bloke in a tie
and your
who looked
AOL
like he wasn't fucking around.
Your AOL CD.
Yeah.
Acme Security, is that?
There we go, something like that. But I thought, no, okay, I'm going to suspend my natural skepticism and take this seriously. It hasn't come to anything yet, but I think it's very plausible to imagine that, you know, the way the war's played out, it hasn't quite ground to a halt, but I don't think it's gone as Putin hoped. We don't know what the end game is, short of him flattening the entire fucking country. And it's not unreasonable to assume that he's going to start throwing more and more shit at the wall for whatever reason. I mean, no one can claim to know what's going on in his head.
No.
But, you know, he might just try stuff. I mean, the most obvious thing would just be to punish the West for all their sanctions and all fucking McDonald's pulling out and shit.
I bet he's not happy about that. I bet he loves a quarter pounder with
Dylan
cheese.
McDonald's,
He's getting a bit jowly, so I bet a lot of that's cheeseburgers.
Yeah, well, people are wondering whether he's ill or something.
Yeah.
Well, he's not going outside, is he?
No, that's true.
No, he doesn't want to go outside anymore.
But you know what? The cybersecurity companies' stocks are going up, so it must be the market must think.
Yeah. I don't think, even if Biden hadn't said that, I don't think it'd be unreasonable to assume there was some aggregate. Actually, I was just thinking about the McDonald's. There was some meme that went round when I think McDonald's, Coca-Cola, and some other sort of junk foodie type
Pizza
of
Hut.
thing, fucking Dunkin' Donuts or something, pulled out, and everyone went, Russia's suddenly become the healthiest country in the world.
Yeah.
Which I thought was a funny meme. But there you go. So yes, I just think that's an interesting one. Apropos, nothing specifically telecoms-y, but I think everyone's going to have to spend.
It's kind of telecoms. It's
because telecoms, there's a security element, definitely.
Yeah.
You know, we certainly speak to vendors all the time who have got very telecoms-focused B2B security products.
These attacks happen over internet infrastructure, obviously.
Yeah. So I think everyone's basically going to have to spend a lot more on security, which I'm not surprised if you've been tracking sort of stocks and all that sort of thing. You know, and again, if I were to abuse my position and think about some companies I've encountered that do specific telecoms, security solutions for telecoms that most people, short of equity analysts, wouldn't have heard of, I'd go off and put my money where my mouth is and buy some shares in them, but I haven't. Yeah. But partly because I'm so ethical, thank you very much. Mm-hmm. And that's why I've only got a tenner's worth of Nokia, or that's about 13, 14 quid now. And I did have 20 quid's worth of Ericsson, which is about 13, 14 quid now as well.
When did you buy it then? Before?
When I first started. So the only time, I've never really speculated.
Echo,
I've never had the spare cash, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, they're still up on where they were when the latest CEO took over. Yeah,
we chatted about that. But from when I bought it, my 20 quid's down to about 17 quid now, I think. But
that's not great.
No, I just did. I got an app called Free Trade and just started fucking about with stocks. Basically, quite soon after the first lockdown, because you know all the stock markets went down the toilet, and I thought even I know there's going to be a correction. You know, this must be a trough. You don't have to be Warren Buffett to think this is probably a trough, so it's probably not a bad time to buy almost anything. Yeah. And you know, we did things like Pierre and I, because Pierre dabbles as well, and we chatted about like buying stocks in like, you know, like travel and tourism and that sort of thing. My best performing stock right now is called Investec, and they're
rings a bell.
Yeah, I mean the name does what it says on the tin, but that's up almost 200% for me, and they give out quite meaty dividends. So that's one of my few successes. I sold about at the start of the year. Or maybe late last year, I started selling a lot of my positions. I mean, I only invested like $1,000 or something. I didn't go crazy. You know, tenner here, tenner there.
Did you short?
No, I don't think. I don't think this. Certainly not on the free version that I've got. They don't give you tools like that. You can't even day trade because there's a delay of several hours between when you put a sell order in and when it comes through. So you can't try and be cute during the day. But I sort of exited a lot of these things that were obviously sort of lockdown specific, like travel and tourism and that sort of thing. Yeah. And then, so what I've got now is a few ones that I had onto that have done all right, and this long tail of fucking garbage that's all down about 70%. But each of them I've got about 20 quid in. But if you look at the long tail of my free trade, I'll show you it after if we go out.
Yeah.
It's just a car crash. But thankfully, I don't have very big positions in any of them. But, you know, there's ones where I get a message where they just go, yeah, we've taken it off because it's not worth anything now, mate. Bad luck. Better luck next time. And that's it. And, you know, that's the thing about investing.
Yeah.
You know, it can just, it's like betting on the horses. Anyway, right, let's move it on. So staying on America, T-Mobile US had a sort of general strategic update, wasn't it? Was it was it in conjunction with annual numbers or anything like that?
No, it wasn't really a strategic update either.
So, okay, well, let's just hand it straight over to you because Mary wrote it up for us. I obviously edited it, but, you know, at this stage in life, you can't expect things to stay in my head for longer than about 2 minutes. So why don't I just give it straight to you? What were they banging on about?
I mean, it was a bit of a sort of whinge about 5G and what they're going to do about it. Right. With Neville Ray, who's their chief technology officer. I think his job title is something like president of technology, which sounds a lot better, doesn't it?
At least he hasn't got something like evangelist in his.
And he basically got on the line. I mean, it's a very glitzy presentation they did, but it didn't have a Q&A session in it, which I don't like.
Right.
You know, I mean, if you're going to do
even the pretense of accountability.
No, I mean it's. And I've had this experience before with American companies, actually. I don't know if it's a thing, but I think if you're going to have a sort of press-facing thing, you should build in a bit of time for questions.
I agree.
You don't just sort of do it. And it all had that appearance of being pre-recorded, so I don't even know if it was live. It was very, very polished.
Produced.
And cut away to people in the studio. I mean, the whole point was, you know, he came on and he sort of went, you know, we're rolling out our 5G network and we're doing really well and we've got loads of subscribers, but there's been too much 5G hype and it's clearly been disappointing, and where's the wave of innovation? It's not there.
Right, so there's a lot of stuff we've been saying for years.
Yeah. And so and what he basically said was that, you know, one of the main problems is carriers have got in the way. You know, they need to get out of the way for 5G to thrive.
And what does he mean by that?
What he means is that he was saying it's just far too hard for small developers to work with carriers. It's, you know, there's too much bureaucracy they have to go through.
So it's just like a Vodafone API type of angle.
Not really. I mean, it's not a like let's hire loads of software engineers and do all of that. It's more about let's open up our facilities to make it easier for developers to come in so they can use our.
So just be more open.
I mean, they've got this new platform, for example, where they provide certain tools to developers that makes it easier for them to come up with ideas and products, and they can use the network more easily. They've even got a big facility where you can come in and test drones out and that sort of thing. You know, you can get chipsets to work on.
Right.
You can get unlimited access to the network for any number of devices while you're trying to work on applications. The whole thing's about making it easier for small people rather than just large enterprises to come along and develop 5G applications on the T-Mobile network that then might become this next big thing, perhaps. Who knows?
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, that all...
You know, I'm trying to sort of look at some of his quotes that I wrote because, 5G. I mean, this is literally what he's. 5G hype's been out of control, and there are lots of people wondering where the breakthrough innovations are. The truth is that developer innovation has been underwhelming so far. It won't take off if carriers won't get out of the way. You know, and then he was saying, you know, buildings need to be more easily accessible. We need programs that are, you know, not just for sort of big companies with resources and time, but, you know, that are, you know, tailored to smaller developers, basically. You know, the whole thing is to give them a kind of Silicon Valley model and not sort of telco bureaucracy.
So that's one of the reasons I invoked the Vodafone thing. I get what you're saying, that they're not announcing that they're hiring loads of sort of coders and developers in-house.
Yeah.
But the broader theme that seems to be in common with the, you know, Vodafone chats we've had, including the one we spoke about in the pod recently, and this is an acknowledgement that if the barriers to sort of interacting with the network are too high for IT types, then that's just not going to fucking bother. Or they'll do it via someone else. They'll sort of circumvent the operators.
But I mean, Vodafone's thing is very much about I mean, we were at that thing where they were talking about APIs, and there's obviously an outreach program there as well, where they want to be able to make it easier for third parties to work with them. But a lot of the in-house activity, having all these software engineers, is partly about developing applications and partly about developing some of their own tools for the network, and partly about being less reliant on systems integrators. I think it's a slightly different. So the thing I didn't really get about, I almost thought it was slightly contradictory about Neville Ray's thing was, and there was nothing at all, by the way, about commercial models with all of this either.
Right. So it's all just more conceptual stuff.
Well, it was. I mean, I could see what they're saying, and they've got this. It's not just conceptual, because they actually showed off this big 24,000 square foot facility they've got near Seattle, I think, where that it's all set up for developers to come in and work with them, and you can get software development kits easily. And the first 1,000 are on us, which implies that the other ones you have to sort of pay to get hold of.
First 1,000 what?
Software
SDKs?
Development kits.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, they didn't really elaborate on that in the thing.
They're going for the sort of heroin dealer model.
Yeah, but the thing I don't really get is he sort of went, carriers need to get out of the way, and then it's like, well, but we're not going to do that. We're going to get in the way, because if you got out of the way, I mean, look, Uber didn't go and develop its application working closely with an operator, did it?
No.
It did it on its own. It didn't have to worry about what the underlying network was. Carriers got out of the way completely, and then it worked really well. And thanks to the availability of 4G networks everywhere, it's all great. So in a way, he's going, we need to get out of the way. So come and work with us. But you're not getting out of the way, then, are you?
Well, but that's the dilemma. That strikes me as the dilemma, because if they completely get out of the way, then they get this existential problem that they've been having for decades of OTT and just being cut out of the loop and just being a dumb pipe. If they completely get out of the way, but then getting in the way in a constructive way, like you talk about Uber, what is a way in which Uber could have in any way been different if there had been closer collaboration with operators? Isn't obvious to me.
Well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? If Uber went and worked with AT&T or Verizon to develop its app, presumably then that app would be something that's bound to the AT&T and Verizon system network. So. And therefore you don't have, and also it wasn't just about 4G. I mean, Dean Bubley's mentioned this before. Uber actually does work on a decent 3G connection. There's nothing network specific about it.
Nothing bandwidth specific.
In fact, I think you can even get it on Wi-Fi at home when you order it. It's not.
Yeah, because there's nothing bandwidth intensive. Some of the work will be done by GPS, presumably.
Yeah, it doesn't. It's not tied to a specific standard. Yeah. So he's positioning this as. Not only it's something where it seems to have to be tied to 5G itself, which I think is a bit of an odd thing when it's a network that's not even that widely deployed at the moment, but also
and doesn't necessarily offer anything.
How do they make money? I mean, this is what I don't understand about the commercial model. If you're a prospective Uber coming up with the next app that takes off, I mean, Uber was like the first sort of unicorn, wasn't it?
It's become a sort of paradigm of a sort of mobile broadband app.
Totally, and the beauty of Uber is that you download it, and it doesn't matter which carrier you're using, you use it everywhere, and that's why it's so successful and so valuable, because you can use it across any network and do whatever you want with it. Well, how does that benefit of T-Mobile saying you come and work with us and then just clear off, and you develop some brilliant app, and AT&T's customers are free to use that as well, and Verizon's customers are as well. How does that then benefit T-Mobile? And if it doesn't do that, and it's something that's actually tied to the T-Mobile network, then I think you're getting into all sorts of potential issues anyway, to do with some of the stuff that Andrea Donner at Vodafone was mentioning in terms of the regulatory side of things and net neutrality.
Net neutrality.
Because the whole thing about net neutrality is not prioritising certain services over others, and the whole concept of an internet service that only works on one company's network is automatically then starting to get you into hot water with the net neutrality crowd.
So none
of this was explained because they didn't have a Q&A, so no one could even ask
and they
about
kept
any of this.
They kept it sort of relatively top line. I mean, I embedded the videos and I watched some of them.
Yeah,
but I got to admit, after a while, Neville Ray's sort of slightly exaggerated delivery got on my tits, and I stopped listening to it.
Yeah,
but
one of the good things about the presentation was they had someone called Rob Roy.
Excellent.
Yeah,
and
he didn't have a kilt on or anything.
But Rob Roy.
That wasn't who. Is that who Mel Gibson was?
No,
that was William Wallace.
Liam Neeson was Rob Roy.
Right, and Mel Gibson was William Wallace.
Exactly. They didn't have a William Wallace, unfortunately.
Well,
but
Rob Roy and William Wallace, were they around at the same time?
Well,
were they mates?
I think Rob Roy's fictional, isn't it? It's based on a book by, what's his name, Walter Raleigh.
Oh, okay.
I think.
Right.
No?
I don't know. I'm just showing my
whereas William Wallace actually existed.
I just know that obviously if you're going to be a figurehead for the Scots around that time, you have to have an alliterative.
And I think it's different. I think Rob Roy's early 18th century.
Right, so they got fuck all
whereas
to do
William
with each
Wallace
other.
is sort of, 1200s?
So only 500 years apart. I was close. Yeah. Only 500 years. I mean, that's close. That is that close. Anyway, so I'll stop talking shit. And yeah, I think another thing in common with the Vodafone chat we had recently, and this, as far as I can tell, is, and this is no criticism of you, but Uber's perhaps not the best illustration, because to answer your question of what advantage is there for developers to have better access to the network, I suspect it's only on B2B stuff, or primarily on B2B
it might be,
stuff.
Well, if it's only on B2B stuff, then they're not going to make the money on it anyway. So, and T-Mobile's not a B2B company.
No, well, that's actually a fucking good point, isn't it? So that doesn't add up. So why do you
anyway.
think they did this? They've gone to the trouble of doing this high production
as an
value
enterprise B2B thing.
So what do you think? What was your gut feel about what the strategic purpose of that event was?
Look, I can see a strategic interest in spurring innovation and making it easier for developers to come along and develop applications. And if there's some way of doing that where you can marry it to your network, and then maybe people then would say, well, we're going to go to T-Mobile because we can get these great services that we can't get on AT&T and Verizon. I think that all sounds brilliant.
Yeah.
The issue is that's kind of not how it's worked in the past. And I think I think you've got all sorts of regulators. I mean, I don't see why developers would necessarily want that. You could have a global app that works anywhere on any network, or you can have something that's tied to T-Mobile's. I mean, for sure, what they're going to want is access to low-cost tools that they can use while they're working on this stuff, and facilities, and the support of people who know about 5G and can tell them about 5G. But I just find it a bit weird in a way that, because as I say, Uber didn't go, we need to work with people who do 4G network stuff when they were developing that. As far as I know, they didn't.
They just knew that they had to have some degree of reliable mobile broadband.
Totally.
But that was it.
Yeah. And again, a lot of this seems like this whole kind of dressing 5G up to be something that it's not really.
Yes.
This whole, it's different from 4G because it's all about low latency and network slicing. And, some of these things just aren't very well explained,
No.
And
I think one of the reasons is because no one really knows. I had a chat with Andrew, who regular followers of the pod will see that he was on the one I did from Mobile World Congress, and he's a deputy editor of Telecoms.com. But he, prior to this, he's an experienced tech journalist, but like when I started, he's not necessarily a network telecoms journalist. So he's obviously been getting up to speed rapidly. And we had a little chat about, I was helping him with a story he was writing and just giving him some background. And we were talking, it was actually, this is a bit of a tangent, but it's something we spoke about a few weeks back about whether 5G is intrinsically faster than 4G pound for pound.
Yeah.
Allowing for fatter pipes and all that sort of thing. Over exactly the same amount of bandwidth on the same spectrum, is it intrinsically faster? To which we haven't really got a satisfactory answer yet, have we? And Andrew, and sometimes it helps to not know that much about it. That's certainly a card I've been playing hard for the last 8 years. And he goes, so what's the point of it then? I was like, well, good question, mate. Good question. And, and the reason I bring it up, other than the fact it's a funny anecdote, is we're still there, aren't we? We're still at the what's the point of it stage.
I thought this is interesting on the Vodafone thing that we went to, where he briefly mentioned 6G, didn't he? I actually wrote a story on this because Howard Watson at BT had said a similar thing. They both said 6G won't be a new air interface. It's already been decided.
Yeah.
I mean, there must have been in some meetings where there's been some feedback that's been going on that 6G will basically use, I think it's OFDM, isn't it, the underlying technology? But isn't 4G also based on OFDM? They're both. I think 4G and 5G, the underlying stuff that goes into it. We used to in the 3G days, it was all wideband CDMA, wasn't it? We used to get more sort of trendy,
WCDO,
not trendy, but more sort of tech acronym, tech abbreviations going on to describe the technologies then. And then it suddenly changed to things like long-term evolution and new radio, which tells
Sounds
you
like
something.
a fudge, doesn't it?
It's a fudge because the underlying stuff's the same. So if 6G is the same.
And FDM's got, is the O stand for orthogonal? Well,
It's
the fuck does
it is
orthogonal mean?
Well, I mean, look, I'm sure there's, at least that sounds like there's a proper sort of physics thing going on there.
Sounds techie.
But if the point is, if 6G is just the same, then it really does put pressure on the guys who are trying to come up with new 6G technologies to what is it going to be there? If it's not, I mean, all the research and development in the past seems to have been to do largely with the air interface, coming up with a new air interface.
Do you know what? We're gonna finally get Neil McRae on.
I know.
We should ask him.
Well, we can ask.
I mean,
that.
we'll let him in advance. We don't ambush people. We always let people know roughly what we're going to chat about. But it'd be interesting to ask a proper high-level techie like him.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know to what extent air interface is his core.
Well, he's a software guy, really.
He's more a software guy, so maybe he wouldn't be the best question to ask. But, if he listens to this, at least get some advance warning of what's going on. But I would like to ask someone, what's new about new radio?
Do you know what I'd like to ask someone? What can you do network slicing on fibre?
Right. I've never thought of that.
Why can't you have, they keep talking about this guaranteed quality of service stuff. I know we need 5G to do that. You can't do that on 4G. We need 5G for network slicing. Well, what about fixed line networks? If you carve out a gaming service for someone, and they're doing it inside the house in a setting where they can use a fixed line network, and they want guarantees of latency. Can they have that on a fixed line network?
I would say to any
slicing,
to any PR or marketing people or whatever who listen to this, whenever we ask those rhetorical questions to which we don't have an answer, we're basically giving buying signals. Where if you can come up with someone who can join in the chat, but who can answer these questions, and not be afraid to be asked direct questions and answer them, then I'd welcome them on, because I think sometimes in our sort of semi-drunken meanderings, we happen upon things that no one's answered, and yet we take them all as read, that new radio is better than old radio. Well, we still don't know why. Yeah. And then your question about, applying some of those same principles to fixed line, why can or can't we? Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say about T-Mobile sort of coming in, but I didn't, is I had a look at some of their numbers recently, because they've been on a sort of bit of a tear, haven't they, for years? Is the perception picking up customers left, right, and
acquisitions,
centres.
But they've been on the whole prepaid, haven't they?
No, postpaid.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, so for instance, in the this is the weird thing about the American market, which I asked one of Omdi's analysts about it. And I can't remember her name off the top of my head because it's the first time I've ever dealt with her. Kristen is her first name.
Oh, that's a start.
But she's obviously based in America and covers the North American market. I mean, one of the weird things about the US market, I think, is every quarter they seem to add hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of new subscribers. And it's not just you could understand that maybe if Verizon and AT&T were hemorrhaging customers, because that's sometimes what happens in the West, isn't it? You get Iliad, for instance, in Italy, getting loads, and Telecom Italia's lost a load,
but you still expect the grand total of all of them to be reasonably stable.
And so I looked at, so the big three obviously now are AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile. Then I looked at what went on in the fourth quarter, and they all added customers, and the total additions was 2 million, which is huge. I mean, I know the US market's big, but to add in one quarter,
so the US population's late 300 millions.
Yeah,
but
obviously there's a lot of kids, there's a lot of old people, there's a lot of most people have already got phones.
I actually don't know if the US population is growing or not. Well, but I don't think it's growing by 2 million a fucking quarter.
So it was 2 million. I mean, Kristen was saying it could be obviously people moving off prepaid contracts. That's still going on, and I think the sort of end of the pandemic, or the perception maybe that we're coming out of the worst stage of this whole coronavirus stuff has buoyed confidence. People spending a bit more. And then there are smaller operators still that that might not be doing so well, and perhaps some of that's moving towards the big three. But the interesting thing about T-Mobile's figures, I thought, is that they're not doing as brilliantly as they used to. So that they I mean, this sounds a lot, but they got 844,000 postpaid customers in the last quarter, and
gained,
yeah,
right.
As I say, it was 2 million between the three of them.
Yeah.
And the one that didn't do very well was Verizon, but AT&T actually got more. It got 884,000.
Wow.
And if you look at the rate of revenue growth as well for T-Mobile, it's really slowed down. So the last quarter, it was only about 2% increase, which is the slowest it's been. If you discount the Sprint takeover, when it obviously went up a lot, for a fourth quarter performance, it's the slowest it's been since 2015.
Right.
So this, and I think some of this sort of stuff that Neville Ray's coming out with about, oh, we need to do more, it's too hype, there's not enough innovation. You sense maybe a bit of, 2 years ago, they're probably happy just to sit back and with their fancy little marketing plans and, we can just collect customers. Maybe there's a sense now that they're facing the same issue that European operators are. Where's the next? Where's
that's
the
why I
growth
asked you the question. From my point of view as a journalist, when someone puts on a public event and the point of it isn't obvious, then you go, well, what's going on? Because people will have had a chat. There will be a strategy there.
Yeah.
And, and if someone does an event and it's a product launch, that's what the event's about. That's fine. You don't need to speculate. Then you just comment on whether they think the product's any good or not.
Yeah.
But if they do an event that's not a product launch, it's not like a quarterlies, it's not a particular thing, but just out of the blue. And that's the same reason why I did that analysis over the Vodafone event. They spent a lot of it talking about fairly vague stuff. And so my brain immediately starts going, so what the fuck's going on here? What was the reason why they bothered to put whatever limited budget they had to spend on getting us in a nice hotel room in Paddington and giving us some nibbles and beers after?
Yeah.
There still has to be a business rationale. I know how companies work. It has to be sold upstream and going, this is why we're doing it. And then, the bloke who signs the checks goes, yeah, fair enough. That seems like a decent use of a few grand.
Yeah.
And I concluded that one of the reasons that they didn't explicitly state, but me reading between the lines, was that